What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over more with the input system. I know this mini-series within the fighting game tutorial series is quite long, but it's of course one of the most important parts. We need our inputs to feel good for our players to be happy with it. So, today specifically we're going to be finishing up the transfer to the new input system. So we now use states as opposed to direct buttons. And before, we were able to do this for player 1. And player 1 on keyboard, and that was it, really. Controller was a little hard because controller uses an input axis for movement. Same as the keyboard, but the difference is you can't just get like one value. It has to reset for you to get to the other side. It's not like pressing A and T. You have to press you have to bring the joystick all the way to the left, or the thumbstick, and then bring it all the way to the right. And you're getting different values that whole time. We already did some stuff that kind of block each input, so there's a lot of specifics here that were stopping us. But we can use our input system that we already made to make this work. So now you'll see I'm able to actually perform commands with my second player. So now player 1 and player 2 can perform commands. And this is really good. This is very exciting stuff. So I can try to get these guys to do it at the same time. But yeah, this is really exciting stuff. And we can also use controllers for both player 1 and player 2 at this point. And now from here on forward, controllers should be pretty much caught up to the keyboard. There are a few things that we'll need to adjust just to make controllers actually a little bit nicer to use, because again, they're different from a keyboard, so there are some things that need to be adjusted to make it just a better experience overall. Regardless, let's get started. There's not too much we have to do in code today. I do make an event. It's not even technically required, but it's just a good practice for the future. So if you go into your fighter template character.h, and at this point, if you have not watched any of the previous episodes, or if you want to get caught up on the entire series, this is episode 64. So we are quite far along at this point. Feel free to catch up. I'll leave a link in the icon in the top right corner right here, and you can get caught up to, it'll be the whole playlist, so you can just see everything that we've worked on. Okay, so in our fighter template character.h, or basically our base character.h, I've gone all the way down to where I have my blueprint implementable events, and I've added a new one called notify player locked in. And what this is doing is this waits until the input components are set up for each player to then call this function. That way we can set up the key bindings once this function has been called, as opposed to on begin play. And the reason for that is, remember, we can actually determine who's player 1 and player 2 once we are in the setup player input component function. We do that here when we determine the game mode is player 1, is player 2. Right after that logic, then I call notify player locked in. This is just in case we wanted to use is player 1 for any sort of logic. We don't have to today, so it's up to you if you want to change this over. But this will ensure that whatever we do after this point will have a valid value for is player 1 is, well, the is player 1 boolean, so you can tell who's player 1, who's player 2. This is important because if you try and use it before this, like in the begin play of the character BP, then you'll actually get a false value no matter what. Okay, so I've added that, and then in my character BP, I've switched over from doing calling the setup input mappings at the end of begin play, and I've switched it over to on this event. So once you've built the code, you can come in and compile, and then you'll be able to get this event by just typing in the name. You can type in event first if you want. Notify player locked in, and here it is. And again, I had this on begin play. I just moved it right down here to this event. So that's a minor change. Again, not necessarily important for this episode, but it is a good practice, and it's what I wanted to start with because we are going to be using this function a lot, so I figured you might as well see that. Alright, and now what we need to do is go into our setup input mappings function. So So before we were going through, setting all of our mappings for both player 1 and player 2, and then we were setting up our input axes. And that's still good. But I've added a few additional changes today. So one thing before we get started is that this could be a little bit optimized. I'm technically doing this contains every loop and branching through, which I don't really have to do. But it is easier for us to understand what's going on. So we can optimize this later, or you can optimize it if you'd like, if you see the way forward. But for me, this was much, much easier to show what was going on. Okay. So if you watched the last episode, you'll have all this. We were looping through our input action mappings, getting the actual actions with their name and their key. And then we were checking for the specific strings. And this is good, because again, these names are never going to change. These are going to be things we define in the project, so we can have them be whatever we want. So this isn't a hard-coded solution or anything. This is just how it is. We've got jump, we've got crouch, we've got all these. Great. But one thing we didn't do was account for player 2. So they were all being added to this. They were being added to the input map. And the input map was being added to player 1's input map. Remember how functions work when they're being called within the character blueprint. So the only reason we have this player 2 reference in here is like we call P2 keyboard jump. The reason we do all that is because we're using the keyboard and this device is being used for multiple players. Remember, think about it this way. If you have 2 controllers, then each controller is going to possess one character, like mutant character BP, and then they can both follow the same logic. They don't need to be separated. If you have one controller, such as a keyboard, controlling multiple players, that's when we need to specify the player this is going to. Like how we did it here for the player 2 controls. Let's go to the project settings and I'll show you a little bit more about this. This is very important to know. So look at this. If you notice throughout the series, all the P2s, jump P2, attack, all these attack P2s, they only have one key to them. But if you look at the P1s, and not all of them are set up yet, but if you look at the P1s where I have set them up, then they all have 2. They have the keyboard and the actual controller button. Well, player 2 can still do all the things player 1 can when you're working with a controller. This is because when you have 2 different devices, then they both essentially do the player 1 logic. They set up the input component with the gamepad buttons. Well, technically they set them up with both of these, but they use P1. So everything that's P1 can be done on controllers. So P1 doesn't really mean player 1 anymore. It just means controllers or player 1 on a device where you have multiple players on that device. Okay? This is really important because everything we do in these P1s now will be what gets used for the final game on controllers. And anything we do on P2 is just if we want to have like an arcade cabinet or a keyboard as a final input device that multiple people can play on. But I do want to support that in the series, so I have to make that completely clear that that's what's going on here. You'll see a lot of these P1s should have 2 inputs, but the P2s will only have 1 input. Alright? And now that that's taken care of, we are going to use this in a little bit, so I'll actually keep this up here. But yes, so now you see that when we're doing something on player 2 specifically, and player 2 is referring to like player 2 on the keyboard at the moment, then we need to pass it into the target. So now let's take a look at this again. This was adding to input map. It was adding both player 1 and player 2's action mappings to the input map. So player 1 had total reign over everything. They had control over all the action mappings. Now player 2 could still do stuff, don't get me wrong, but none of his actual combos or input buffer logic was working. Because for player 2, they didn't have any inputs. They were all E_none. And that's what we're fixing right now. So what I've done is, off of the action key mapping, I take the name and I do a contains on it. Now, the way you get contains you guys have already done this, but just to show you, is you go to string, like this, and then you do contains, and it is the string contains. Okay? So I'm searching for the substring of P2. So basically, if this is player 2, I know I only want to add this as an input mapping to player 2. Otherwise, we're going to add it to P1. So basically, if this is true, substring P2 is contained within this action name. So like jump P2, whatever. Then we're going to go up. We're going to make sure the player 2 reference is valid, because it's possible I'm just spamming keys and the player 2 reference is not valid. But if it is valid, then we're going to check all the same logic that P1 did. Basically, does the string then contain jump? And if it does, then add it to the input map. But use the target of player 2 reference. And for the record, yes, this does not need to be done in the character blueprint, because the logic will fire 2 times. Once for each character that has called setup input player component. So it is important to note, this could be done in the game mode. We did it in the character last time, and I didn't change it over. Feel free to change it out. Although it's not necessary, it can stay in the character and shouldn't cause any issues. At this point, you can copy literally everything for P1 and put it in for P2. Just copy it, paste it up above. I'm trying to get a good shot for you. Right about there is good. You can see this is the exact same logic the whole way along. The only thing that's changing every time is, instead of having the target as self for P1, the target is player 2 reference. You can see I brought the line along, and I drag it into every single one. Alright, so that fixes the issue where player 2 does not have any inputs in their input map, which is good. That's the first thing we need to do. That allows us to be able to give player 2 successful inputs for an input buffer. But we need to do the same thing for input axes, as you can imagine. So as soon as I break off of the input axis key mapping, I do a search for P2. I do a branch to see if it contains it. If it does, I grab the player 2 reference, make sure it's valid, and then do the same logic as I did below, but passing in the player 2 reference as the target. So here's the original. This is what we did last episode. And then here's the new one, which is what we did this episode. You can, again, copy and paste and just drag in the player 2 reference. Okay, now I don't have anything in here for is flipped or has flipped or anything like that, so technically your commands aren't going to get switched if you change sides, and that's expected as of now. That'll be for the next one, when we're doing like more advanced things like multiple buttons and holding buttons. Just so you're aware though, that's not intended to work yet. And then I've made a new function, and I've called it setup player mappings. So you can add a function here, call it setup player mappings. Now before we fill that out, let's call it. Remember how at the end of the first for loop and setup input mappings, I was calling setup input axes? Well, now at the end of the first for loop and setup input axes, I'm calling setup player mappings. Now, this might sound a little bit confusing. Like, didn't we just do that? Yeah, we just set up the player mappings, but there's something very, very important we have to think about here. So at this point, we have inputs being added to the player 1 input map and the player 2 input map. But something we're missing. So how do we determine on a one input device? Like for 2 inputs, sure, that's good. If we have 2 controllers, then sure, everyone's going to go through the player 1 input mappings and they're going to get their controls that work for it, and we should be good. But on one device, how do we separate them? Well, we need to go into our event graph, and we need to add the logic for add to input buffer P2. So we have both of these. We have add to input buffer P1 and add to input buffer P2. Although add to input buffer P2 was not in our event graph previously. And add to input buffer P1 was set to any key. So basically, any key we press, and by the way, any key also works for buttons. So any input that we press, whether it's on keyboard or controller, is going to call this event. Well, good. But remember, player 1 doesn't have access to every single control on the keyboard. If this keyboard is being broken up to multiple devices, then we need to make sure that player 2 also has keys that they can access and that are specific to them. So let's take a look at our add to input buffer P1 function. We were getting our key display name and adding it to the input buffer. Good. We need to do this for player 2. And remember the same logic I was just telling you. Anytime that we're using player 2 in regards to the keyboard or one controller with multiple players, we need to give it the reference. So first things first, our input buffer. We don't want to access the player 1 input buffer when performing an action. We need to add to input buffer P2. Okay, so basically copy everything right here, add to input buffer P1, paste it, change the event to add to input buffer P2. Alright, so instead of P1, change it to P2. And then we're going to, instead of using the input buffer here for player 1, grab your player 2 reference, convert to validated get. I guess I should show you in case you're not aware. You can drag your player reference here and convert to validated get. I apologize for not mentioning that earlier, but that is how you get it to look like that. And this just does an isValid check on that variable before it gets used. And then drag off of this and type input buffer. We need to use player 2's input buffer, not player 1's. The difference is very important here, because if we're separating the keys for player 1 and player 2, we need to know whose keys we're using, who's got what input stack. The other change we have to make here is for when we do add input to input buffer, it also takes in a target. Well, we're going to need our player 2 reference, and we need our map to be off of player 2, because now our maps bind strings to enums. So basically, they bind the keys or buttons we press to the enum value. And if the keys we have to press for player 2 are different than player 1 to perform the same command, then the map is not going to line up if we're using player 1's. So we need to make sure we're using player 2 reference, we're using the input to input type map. So get it, just like this. You can see they're connected here. I know it's a little close, but you should be able to see that. And then also drag it into the add input to input buffer on the target. And at that point, we've made the changes necessary for both player 1 and player 2 to be able to add these to their input stack. But it is important that we mention that. I felt the need to go into that in depth so that you guys were aware. Now, before we go into our setup player mappings function, let's go to our project settings and input, which I went way past it. Okay. So, now, there's something else we have to do here. These add to input buffer, P1 and P2. Remember for the longest time that I was telling you, any key is not really the best solution here, because you can press anything on the keyboard or anything on any controller and it will pick it up. You don't really want that. So instead of going through and hard coding all these keys, because what if a character or a player changes their key? Or what if we want a different input? Then we have to keep track of this. Instead of doing that, what we can do is basically use some of the logic in our change controller widget and make this action mapping with all of the values that come from all the other ones we have. Like, for example, if jump P2 is up, then up should be in the P2 input buffer. Okay? If attack 1 P2 is I, then it should be in the P2 input buffer. And you can see it is, even in order. And that's the way that works. We're basically going to go through and make sure that everything that has P2 in it is going to be in the P2 input buffer. Otherwise, everything's going to be in the P1 input buffer. And if it's in the P1 input buffer, remember, if you're using controllers, it will work for both players. And that's what the setup player mappings function is going to do. So let's go through it again. This is basically the same startup as the other two functions. Technically, I don't do anything with the axes here, and you could. Although since I only have move right, it's actually not necessary for me to do so. We're going to, I'll show you. You can literally copy this if you want. You don't have to. But to make your life easier, you can copy those 5 nodes. get input settings, get the action names from it, do a for each loop from the name, get action mapping by name, and then loop through that. And that's what we always do to start this. And then we break it, right? And then we do a contains like usual. So this is basically the same function as the other two that we've already done up to this point. But here's the difference. What we do is we check if the name of this input action key mapping contains P1. If it contains P1, then we use the key. Okay, we drag off the key, and we're going to make input action key mapping. So I don't know if you can do it right off of this. Make input, you can. Input action key mapping, right like this. Okay, you're going to extend it. Make sure that all these are good. You can keep it smaller if you don't need any of the Shift, Control, Alt, Command keys held while doing this. But, okay, so we have the key brought in, and we need to put our action name as the name of the any key action name. So for me, it's add to input buffer P1. So if it has P1 in the substring, then I want to add this key to this action name. And it will generate this list with all of the keys that had P1 in it. So P1 will instantly, those were the only keys that will go toward the input buffer. Not any key on the keyboard, not any key on any given controller, but only the things that have P1 in it. And then you drag off of this, and you can say, add action mapping. Actually, you have to do it separate. So you'll have to drag off of, this is the input settings. You see that? Drag off of input settings and say, add action mapping, and then drag your key mapping in. You can keep the force rebuild key maps the same. It basically just means it remakes it every time. It's not actually necessary in this case, but we can get more into why you might want that and why you might not want that in the next episode. Then, if it's false, I go to another branch. This branch consists of a search on this action key mapping to see if the substring P2 is in the name. If P2 is in the name, then we do the exact same logic. I make input action key mapping using the key, but I give it to add to input buffer P2. So only these keys and buttons will be able to be used for P2. And then we add it to the action mapping. And that's really, really useful. That allows us to be able to separate the keys and the buttons for both player 1 and player 2 on controller and on keyboard at this point. Which is exactly what we need. And now, that's really, really good. At this point, we're looking very good. There is something else we need to do. Well, we don't technically have to, but let me show you what the benefit is. In our input axes in our project settings, before I was just using gamepad left thumbstick X axis. Now, this works, okay? There's nothing wrong with this. This will get the value, whatever the axis value is. But this makes commands very hard for the controller. Because again, if you have to say something like a quarter circle punch, which I know we haven't done that yet in the series, but think about it. The scale would have to be, you have to figure the scale out the entire time. Great, that's perfect for this. But now, think about you have to do like back forward punch, forward back punch, something like that. Well, now the problem is we have to go from right to left to this value. So this scale is always going to be changing while you're doing it, which again, not really a problem, but it would be easier if we could just use our these values. So gamepad left thumbstick left, gamepad left thumbstick right. What these do is they wait to see if you receive left from this controller. It's not grabbing your value the whole time, it's just saying, have you gone to the left? Have you gone to the right? And by doing this, it actually allows us to, we can set the scale. So left is -1, right is 1. And by doing that, then our input key axes, or setup input axes here, actually will handle that. We don't have to do anything specific. We're already covering the substring for move right. And since that is move right controller, it is going to get called in there. And it's going to then add these inputs to the player 1 input map, which remember, player 1 input map works for both player 1 and player 2 when you're working on controllers. So then it'll just look for -1 and 1. It'll look for these values, as opposed to reading all the values for the x-axis and trying to get it. Like, you can try it without it and see what I mean, but if you do it without these left and rights, you're going to very, very rarely be able to perform this, because basically the way you'll be able to perform commands is you'll have to flick it so fast that it doesn't even detect the other inputs, or it doesn't detect them well enough to cancel it. And that's just not something that's really worth your time. When we're going for user friendliness over here, we don't want to make it so that they have to like be breaking their stick to perform a simple command. So we can keep the x-axis, it is useful, but sometimes we want the thumbsticks just to say, yep, left and right, and that's all we want to recognize. Once you do that, you should be able to perform all your commands. Now, if you go into your event graph, if you're having any issues, this is a complicated episode. Remember, I have these print strings. I had it for P1. You can also set it up for P2. Make sure when you're pressing the keys, they are getting the right enum value. If they say none and you're pressing a key that should be involved, it should be logging to the screen, and guess what? You know what your issue is, don't you? So, remember, there's no logic for flipping. So while I'm going forward for player 2, it's still logging as backward, but that's fine. I'm getting all the correct inputs as I do these things. And now same with this. I'm getting all the correct values as I do these things. And once you have the correct values, I mean, it's as simple as performing the action you want to perform. Fireball. Or, there we go. I forgot what the input was. So it should be this on player 1. There we go. Yeah, so you can see player 1 and player 2 can do the same commands. Last thing I want to mention here is make sure if you're doing the switch from keyboard to controllers or controllers to keyboard that you go into your game mode and force that is device for multiple players to be the correct value. Otherwise you won't be able to move and you might be confused and think your game's broken. Your game's not broken. You just need to adjust that, and we'll put in auto detection fairly soon. I'll put it on high priority, but for now just make sure you have this variable set correctly. Alright guys, well thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and this is a video I'm very, very excited about. I'm very proud of the input system, and I can't wait to see what else we can do with it. We're going to be going over, again, held inputs, charged inputs, holding multiple, or pressing multiple buttons or keys for one action, all sorts of different things, and this system's going to make it a lot easier. If this video helped you, and you want to keep up with this series and how it's progressing, feel free to subscribe. It does more for me than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters and my YouTube membership subscribers. The links for both of those are in the description if you want to come give me some extra support. Basically just helps me continue these series with full life force. It keeps giving me encouragement. It's by no means required, but you will get some benefits if you do decide to do that. Lastly guys, if you want to come support us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27. I do gaming live streams and programming live streams, and we also do programming live streams right here on this channel every Friday. So you can check it out right here, Friday, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's all I got for you today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.